Well, good morning, everybody. Happy Father's Day. So glad you're here. Happy Juneteenth. So glad you're here. We're excited to continue in this series. Like A said, my name's Kurt, and Pastor David did a great job last Sunday covering what is the Bible, so we're not going to do that over again. But today, you can give it to Pastor David. He can hear you. Today, we're in this series, and the goal of this series has been to take a moment and to ask some questions that often, if we're honest, they can seem so simple, and yet they can get so easily overcomplicated. And so how do we actually pause and give ourselves and each other permission to say, hey, what is baptism all about? And is it for me? What is the Bible? Can I trust it? What is the church, and why does it matter? And what is prayer, and how should we do it? And so that's what we're looking at for this month's series, and it's just been such a powerful series to break down these things that can sometimes, like I said, get so easily overcomplicated, to really see that the heart that God has for all of us is to become approachable and connected to the thing that He has in store for us. And today we're talking about this idea of what is the church? Why do we do this, right? Why do we gather? What's the point of it? Does it even matter? And, as we kind of prepare for these things, I do different ways of researching, why we do these things, and as I study. And for this one, I thought, instead of going back to my religious studies degree and doing all the church history stuff, I kind of want to look at where are we at now in our culture in this time, because I don't know about you, it feels like the world's changed quite a bit in the last couple of years. I was at the store the other day, and they were like, oh yeah, blah, blah, we're talking about, I'm like, oh yeah, that was a long time ago. And they were like, that was 2019. I'm like, yeah, wow. So if you're like me and the last 2 years has aged you 20, that's okay. So rather than going back, through church history, we're going to look at where are we at now and where did this idea come from, right? So we're going to kind of look at the bookends of the extreme. But specifically, the last few years, we have seen statistic after statistic that have shown us that we have this ever-growing complication with our relationship with the church. As humans, specifically in the West, and in America even more specifically. And my guess is you, at some level, have had that same tension. We've had to figure out how to do church in new ways over the last 2 years that really no one else in our lifetime has had to figure out. And I was doing some research, and I came across this Barna study that said about 10 years in between, they kind of measured how many people engaged with the church and had a good relationship with it. And in 2009, almost 50% of adults in America went to church, any kind of church, right, on a weekly basis. Like 50% of adults went to church every week. And in 10 years, in January of 2020, that number had dropped to under 30%. And I know what you're thinking. That was pre-COVID, and you're right? And actually, post-lockdown, as we kind of reopened, most churches have reported that they have a reopening attendance of 36% of the numbers that they had pre-COVID, right? So more and more and more people are disengaging from the church. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, is this just one of those callback messages? And I get it. And the answer to that is yes, of course it is. But more importantly than that is if you're watching online or if you're here, you already got that. At some level, for some reason, you're one of those smaller percentage. And the important thing that we're going to kind of unpack together today is if church is just a club to gather to, if church is just a place to attend, then you won. Gold star, we should just throw a party and skip the message. But if the church is what Jesus set out for it to be, which I believe it still can be, then there's actually much more that those of us that call ourselves followers of Jesus, we don't have all of our life figured out, but those of us that are trying to figure out what it looks like to follow Jesus, this is actually an extraordinarily important conversation because how other people view the church or our church actually has really big implications for how we should engage with them. And so beyond just the numbers, right, the harder part to really think of, especially for me and Katie as pastors, we have friends that represent these numbers I'm about to tell you, is that in the last 2 years, 2 out of 5 churches in America have either restructured significantly, had to merge with another church, or close their doors altogether. The 2 out of 5. So not only are less people engaging, but now there's less options to pick from, right? And again, we can't just blame COVID for everything, right? That's the easy way out. But the behavior of Christians bickering online or on the side of the road, right? The inability for many of us to name the subcurrent of Christian nationalism or white supremacy that no longer hangs out on the fringes but has become kind of the dominant perception of the church to the watching world. Whether it's the church's failure to acknowledge and repent of its sins of exclusion and oppression based on gender, race, national origin, gender identity, or sexual orientation, right? Whether it's the news stories or the podcasts about corruption or abuse or hypocrisy at the hands of church leaders. I mean, let's be honest, there are just so many reasons, and I would say honest and fair reasons, to ask the question, is there even hope for this thing called the church? Like, is the church still worth engaging in? Is it worth the effort and the time and the energy that it takes to figure out how to fit the church into my life, or better said, how to fit my life and what I'm going through and our stories to fit that into this idea of the church? Is the church even worth it in our world today? Is it even worth it in our lives? And I think, and I know you'll be surprised by this, right, that it actually is worth having that conversation. I think it's actually worth having perhaps the painful, perhaps the surprising, perhaps even the self-abating conversation that in spite of the challenges, imperfections, and complications that the church clearly has, I think it's worth asking that question. Tim Keller famously wrote that when the church as a whole is no longer seen as speaking to the questions that transcend politics, when it's no longer united by a common faith that transcends politics, then the world will see strong evidence that Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx were actually right when they wrote that religion is really just a cover for people wanting to get their own way in the world. And I read quotes like that, and maybe you hear that, and you're like, yeah, he said it. And again, that's a white Reformed pastor, right? So, like, there is something in all of us that has to take a strong look and ask that question. Isn't there more to this idea of the church than perhaps what we feel and bump into in our culture right now? And again, quick confession. In case you didn't know, I'm a pastor, right? So my occupation creates a clear assumption as to my position on whether or not I think the church is worth fighting for. But beyond that, right? If I were just to share with you my story, and I've heard so many of yours, and in spite of its flaws, when the church is at her best, I actually believe that there's a beautiful vision that is valuable and true, and it's God's vision for the church that, if we're honest, looks a whole lot different than sometimes what we bump into on our social media feeds or on our news channels. And I, even as a pastor, still struggle with and wrestle with a lot of the tensions that maybe you have, or that your friends who don't belong to a church or who used to go to church wrestle with. I have those same tensions. And I often, if I'm really honest, find myself aligning more with my friends who have left the church for whatever variety of reasons, who have this increased level of dissonance with the motif of Christianity in our world today that floats around in our culture. I often find myself aligning more with them than perhaps others that go to church on a regular basis. I had a DM conversation with a friend after something I posted a couple weeks ago, and they said, you know, it's not that we're hurting as much as I think the system of the church is broken. And we began to engage dialogue, and I said, I think it's both. I think definitely at some level, anytime anger or bitterness or rejection shows up somewhere, perhaps deep down beyond where we would like to admit or explore, there's this sense of disappointment or hurt or even betrayal or dissatisfaction. And I think a lot of my friends, and perhaps many of yours, perhaps even many of us sitting in this room or watching online, listening to my voice later, you have felt that same dissonance, that same disappointment with what you believe the church could be, and for good reason. And so my hope is for the rest of our time together is not that we have a pity party about how bad it is, because it's gotten a little somber in here real quick. Don't worry, we got root beer later. You'll perk right up, right? But to actually ask the question, if that's the reality, we have to acknowledge that that is a reality, maybe not for all of us, but more importantly for those looking at the church on the outside. That's actually what really matters, is what do they think about it? We have to ask the question, for those of us who are the church, according to Jesus, as we're going to discover in just a moment, what do we need to look at? What do we need to perhaps change or adapt? And ask ourselves the question that if the original design, if Jesus' original vision for the church looks different than what we see or experience in our world today, right? Is there a question that we might have to ask of how do we actually be the church here in our time and place to create space for each of us to decide, is this something we want to be a part of building, advancing, or even restoring, right? So that's where we're going for the next 25 to 30 minutes or so, all right? Because here's this incredible reality that is such an important question that we have to understand. It's, as you read the scriptures, if you've spent any time in the Gospels, in the 4 accounts of the life of Jesus in this book, you have to come to the natural conclusion that the people who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus, and Jesus liked them. I mean, like, don't let that sink past you too quickly. As you engage with the scriptures, right? This book that tells us primarily, not exclusively as we learned last week, but primarily about the life and teachings of this man named Jesus of Nazareth, who we believe to be the Son of God. People who were nothing like Jesus really enjoyed being around him. I mean, they invited him over to parties, so much so that religious leaders went, to stand on the courtyard and peer in because, they want to be near it, but you can't be seen. It's like a Baptist at a liquor store, right? It's like, oh, it's so weird. I was looking for something for my friend. It's like they're there peering in, watching what's going on, and they're just scoffing at Jesus. Why does your leader hang out with this kind of people? But people who were nothing like him, the people that had been counted out by religion, found themselves experiencing radical belonging in the community around Jesus. And in his eyes, they didn't see judgment, change, or else. They saw love and compassion, challenge and invitation. But there was this sense that, man, I'm nothing like you, but I like you. And friends, I think that's the invitation for the church. I think that's the invitation for who we are to become as the people of God. And so to get there, we're going to look at this story captured by a guy named Matthew. His Jewish name was Levi, but he changed his name to Matthew because he became a tax collector. He basically sold out to the empire. In first century Jewish context, right, it's really impossible for us to even fully grasp and understand this level of cultural betrayal that Matthew had gone through. We call him, Saint Matthew, author of the Bible, right? For us, he's a big deal, but in his growing up in his town, going from Levi to Matthew was a really, really, really big step backwards. He made a lot of money. He had great friends and great clothes and lived in a nice house and was literate, which is great for us, right? Because we get to read the Gospel of Matthew later, which was rare at that time, right? He had all the things that the world had to offer, but yet he captures this sense in his life and in his gospel that Jesus says, what good does it a person to gain everything in the world but lose your soul? He had lived that life. He had lived that story. And so while he was rich and well-known and had plenty of people around him, he had this sense of this ache in his soul of something was not quite right because he had missed what he believed God was doing in his life. And so when Jesus walks up to his tax collection booth, right, not only did that surprise all of Jesus' followers at the time, because you didn't go there unless you were ready to pay some money, and you certainly didn't ask any of those people taking our money and stealing from us, good Jewish people, to come and be a part of your inner circle. But yeah, that's exactly what Jesus did. And so when you read the gospel according to Matthew, you're really reading the story of someone who understood the powerful grace and restoration of Jesus. And so as we go there together, I hope that will be the lens through which we recognize how Matthew brings his stories of his experience and his encounters to Jesus to life. And so if you have a Bible, you can turn to Matthew chapter 16. If not, like Ace said, there's a Bible in the seat back pocket directly in front of you or under your seat if you're in one of the front rows. And it's on page 588 in this blue Bible. And he told you already, but if you don't have a copy of the scriptures that you can read and understand, this Bible that you're holding is now our gift to you. We love having to replace them so that people can engage with this book that can be challenging, can be difficult to understand, but we believe there's life to be found in it. So grab it, follow along. We're going to start in verse 13. I'm going to pause at certain moments and ask you to shout some things out. So either follow along in the Bible in front of you. If you're online, you can open another tab. But here we go, Matthew 16, starting in verse 13. So when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" Now, this is a question you should never ask unless you're really emotionally secure, right? Who do people say that I am? What's the word on the street about me? Well, they replied, some people say you're John the Baptist, like maybe they believed in reincarnation, right? Some say that you're Elijah. Others say Jeremiah or another one of the prophets. What they're saying here is people believe good things about you. Like people believe that you're worth listening to. But then Jesus asked them, "But who do you say?" This is where you shout it out. It's where I pause. Sorry, I messed up the rules. Here's where I pause, and then you have it here. It's up there. You can say it out loud, all right? So here you go. But then he asked them, we'll try again. But then he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Right? Who do you say that I am? And I think this is a really important question because this gets at the heart of what the church is all about. People know who we say Jesus is. But I think the question we're invited to ask our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, our family members, who do they believe Jesus to be? And to really go a step deeper, who do they believe Jesus to be based on who they see us believing Jesus to be? Not by the words we say, but by the life we live, by how we treat them, by what our priorities are. Do we look any different than what their life is? Are we changed from the inside out because of spending time with Jesus? This was the question that Jesus asked his immediate followers. And Simon Peter answered, because Simon Peter always spoke first, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." I mean, wow, that's a big sentence. You're the Messiah. You're the one we've been waiting for. Our whole life we've been told these stories about how one day someone was going to come and free Israel from their oppressors, free them from themselves. I believe you're that person. And Jesus replied, "You are blessed, Simon, son of John, because my Father in heaven has actually revealed this to you. You did not learn this from any human being. So now I say to you that you are now Peter," which means rock. "And upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of Hades will not overcome it." Now, that word church right there, when Jesus originally spoke, he spoke in Aramaic. Again, Pastor David's so smart. He taught us all this last week, right? And it was transcribed in Greek. And then what happens is over the course of a couple hundred years, eventually the Bible is translated into German and then into English, right? And so that's kind of the habit that we kind of walk through as we get to our English scriptures as we're walking through that history. And so when Jesus initially spoke those words and said church, right, the Greek transliteration of the word that he used is ekklesia. You maybe heard me use that phrase before. Ekklesia is this idea of two common things that we have in our world that he kind of put together, which means the called out ones or a gathering of light, right? It can mean both of those things. So this idea is that you're these people that have been called, you've been invited, but you're also light to shine into the world. Right, so it's this twofold thing. It's this gathering. It's a congregation. It's a group of people is the idea that Jesus spoke. But then as the Bible got translated, it became this German word for church is how we translate it, but the German word really means house of the Lord. Right, maybe you've heard of that. Like, I want to go to the house of the Lord. What you mean is you want to go to a building. If you come here to 10960 Via Frontera, like I'm so glad you made it. Like this is where we gather, but this is not the church. This was an office building 20 years ago. Someday in the future, by God's grace, we'll need a bigger building, and this might become an office building again. Like this is not holy ground. But you are. And so when we gather together, great things happen. God meets us here, but come on a Tuesday at 5 p.m. and everybody's gone, it's just empty. But what Peter hears, what Matthew hears when Jesus speaks this idea is that I'm going to build a congregation. I'm going to build this gathering. And they're looking around like the couple dozen of them going, really? Like we're out here in Caesarea Philippi, like we're out on the outskirts of Jerusalem, like you're going to do a what now? There's not so many people. Like if we want to do a gathering, we should go back to the city. We should go back to Jerusalem where the people are. We should go back to the center of religion. But Jesus says, no, it's not that kind of gathering. Right? In fact, William Tyndale, who might have his name stamped on the seam of your Bible, which is now one of the highest producing publishers of the scriptures, was a literist who actually lost his life because he said that word in this passage should not be translated house of the Lord. It should be translated ecclesia. It should be translated a gathering, a congregation, the called out ones, the people of light. And notice what Jesus says at the end. And the powers of Hades, right, which doesn't necessarily mean hell, but more like the idea of death and destruction, the power of Hades will not overcome it or overtake it or subdue it. Jesus clearly meant for his church to not play defense. Like don't misunderstand this, right? Like the idea here is that I am sending you, right? I'm calling you out and I'm sending you out to be on offense. That even the power of death is not going to be able to hold back this mission. My death's not going to stop it. Peter, your death's not going to stop it. Matthew, your death's not going to stop it. The empire that we believe is so evil and oppressive, it's not going to stop it. I mean, this is such an incredibly difficult question for historians to answer about this gathering, right? They've wondered and been troubled by this for generations. People that do not believe that Jesus is who Jesus claimed to be. But they ask this question: how did a first century cult in the armpit of the Roman Empire, whose leader was rejected and crucified by his own people, survive and even thrive in the midst of violent, organized, state-sponsored persecution and eventually become embraced by the very empire that tried to snuff it out for 300 years? How did that happen? We have to ask that question. Why are we even here? And this is what I love about this passage. It's not just a story, it's actually a prophecy. It's a prophecy that's fulfilled because you're hearing my words right now. That you are the answer to Jesus' prophecy. Put that on your LinkedIn page, right? You should hire me. I'm the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy. It's nice to meet you. I also am fluent in Google Sheets. Anyway, all right, so again, back to the passage, right? This is so important because I think for many of us, if we're honest, like can I just be real for a second? Like for many of us, if we're honest, Jesus says his gathering is not going to be able to be overcome by the powers of death. But we spend so much of our lives trying to avoid the power of death. We try to stay away from the world. We only have Christian friends, only listen to Christian music. We do Christian book clubs. We call them Bible studies, right? We even have Christian yoga because regular yoga is just, scary, right? And whatever else the Christian world has tried to create, which is really only to get you to spend more money, right? Let's be honest. It's not even spiritual. But Jesus actually says, no, you can actually go anywhere because the power of the Spirit of God is within you. That there isn't a sacred place anymore. That the temple model of the Jewish religion, and I'll be honest, most American Christianity, the temple model of I got to go to a certain place to be in the presence of God, he says that's actually over. And that the presence of God is now in portable, movable temples with human heartbeats of every shade and every gender and every color from every country on this incredible planet, moving around at every moment. That every person you lock eyes with has the image of God stamped on them, and that you are invited to be on mission with the one who gave his life to start the church. I mean, that's what we're actually invited into, which, friends, is so much more than just a 1-hour event on a Sunday morning. It's so much bigger. And again, that changes, I mean, shouldn't it? That changes our frame about how we engage with the world. Because if our heart is to defend the faith, we're playing defense. But if our heart is to join the mission of God, to step into places where darkness clearly has the upper hand without fear and say, no, I'm here to bring light and love, to actually follow Jesus, then we're going to engage with the world the way Jesus did. I mean, this is what it means to love and follow Jesus, is to engage with the world around us the way he would if he were in our circumstance. This Jesus who was constantly being judged, not by outsiders, but by religious leaders, who was so willing to get close to those who in the first century were considered spiritually unclean and then actually touch them, say their name, go to their house, align his reputation with theirs. And let's not miss this. Their dirtiness didn't rub off on him, but his holiness absolutely transformed their life. This is what it means to follow Jesus. This is actually what we've been invited into. Not to worry about being unclean, that we might tarnish or contaminate his reputation, but instead to step into his reputation and represent Jesus to a fallen world. Not with judgment, but to offer a hand, to help, to step across the line and not wait for them to come to us. To see that when Jesus touched those that religion says was on the outside, power didn't, come to him from his example, but power left him, and they were healed. They became well. They were able to see. They were seen themselves, and they were made whole. And so if you would call yourself a follower of Jesus, which I know may not be all of us, but if you have decided to trust and put your life in the best way you know how to say, I am trying to love and follow Jesus, then this is what we are supposed to do. I mean, this is what the church is supposed to look like. This gathering that Jesus was talking about, right? These were people who were most uncomfortable with temple religion because they were comfortable with Jesus. And people who were most comfortable with temple religion found themselves very uncomfortable with Jesus. And so the church, friends, you and me, should embrace the reality that what was true about Jesus individually should be true about us collectively. What was true about Jesus individually should be true about us collectively. And imagine the rhetoric if that were true. I cannot believe they believe someone came back from the dead. And then they eat his body and his blood, so weird. What? And every now and again, they cheer really loud and ring cowbells when people go swimming in church. These people are weird. I don't believe what they believe. I can't get around that theologically. But you know what? I want to work for one. I hope my kids marry one someday because they just treat their spouses with so much respect. It's unbelievable. Gosh, I hope that they move into my neighborhood because all of a sudden we're just going to have this harmonious, hospitable sense to our community. Because wherever they go, they just want to serve me. And they show up with food. And it's amazing because apparently their leader loves to eat with people and I'm ready to party. You know what? I can't get around theologically what they believe. It just feels too constricting to me. But you know what? When I lost my job, they gave me money to make sure our lights stayed on. Or when I lost someone I loved, like they came over and just sat with me. They didn't force their beliefs on me, but they said, hey, can I pray for you? And I'm like, at that point, sure. Guys, what was true about Jesus individually? What if that was true about us? Because I think the answer to that historical question that historians can't wrap their mind around as to how this sect, this cult, this offshoot of the Jewish religion actually survived its first couple hundred years to become the largest claimed religion in the world. The reason that happened, as broken as parts of that story are, how it started was because they did exactly that. They cared for the sick. That when people said, oh, it's a baby girl, I don't want her, and they would leave her outside the gate of their city, it was the Christians that went out and grabbed her and raised her. That they would see this gathering, this group of people come together, men and women, old and young, slave and free, worship together. I mean, this is how it changed the world. This is how it survived the power of death, because most of them died for it. And so if we jump forward to where we are now, there's a really challenging question. Would I have survived the first 300 years of Christianity? Would Restoration Church have survived the first 300 years before it was called Christianity, when it was called the Way, when it was the gathering? Would we have been able to make it? Because we are sitting in the legacy, as the author of Hebrews said, there's this cloud of witnesses that gave their life so that you and I could even be here. I mean, like, don't let that flow past you too quickly. And so, Jesus is there. He tells his buddies, these men and women, I'm going to build this gathering, right? And I'm going to build it on this statement, Peter, that you just said. And this idea that even death can't compete with it. And then he teaches and leads, and everything's looking like it's going really well. But then he gets arrested. And Peter's like, the gates of hell will not prevail, and cuts off a guard's ear, right? He just, he missed the point a little bit, right? But then Jesus heals the guard, and Peter's like, what? So, all right, so Jesus gets arrested, and he's killed, and he dies. And that's what we celebrate at Good Friday. But that first Good Friday wasn't so good, and there was no celebration. They were like, wait, this was a turn we did not expect. And is the movement over? For Peter, it was. He went back to his old life. He goes, well, shoot. I thought Jesus was like this, but I guess I was wrong. I guess I got to go back to fishing. Wasted 3 years of my life following that crazy person. And that was their perspective. And then they see Jesus risen from the dead, and everything changes. And Peter, who goes from giving up and literally throwing in the net instead of a towel, you get the pun, but it's all right. It's Father's Day. I get to make one dad joke. All right. He goes, oh my gosh, I'm so ashamed of rejecting Jesus and not standing up for him in this moment of need. And isn't it funny how when the scene changes, we can reinterpret all of our best decisions, right? And Jesus restores Peter, and the charge he gives him is, if you love me, will you feed my sheep? Will you watch my sheep? Will you take care of my sheep? And Jesus is reminding him that he called him away from being a fisherman his old life and called him into being a shepherd, right, to care for and to lead people. And Peter probably remembers, that's right, you said you're going to make me fishers of people. And I went back to getting some sushi. And so he invites him back in, right? We're never too far from God. This is the idea of the church, is that it's based on Jesus. It's not based on us. And so at the very end of his time on the planet, in Matthew 28, flip over to page 598 in the Blue Bible, right? Jesus has resurrected. He invites all his followers out to a hillside, right? There's a lot fewer of them now. And it says this, Matthew records this for us. Thankfully, it says in verse 16, then the 11 disciples, because Judas freaked out and hung himself, left for Galilee, right? And they went to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. And just for a pause there for a second, like, imagine if Judas had been there still. Like, both Judas and Peter denied Jesus. And Peter received forgiveness and forgave himself. And Judas couldn't. Because he spent too much time following Jesus, thinking Jesus was who he wanted him to be, instead of seeing Jesus for who he was. And I think for most of us, friends, we follow Jesus like Judas. And so when Jesus doesn't show up, when Jesus doesn't come through, when Jesus doesn't behave the way we think he should, we give up. Not just on Jesus, but even on ourselves. And friends, can I just encourage you, you have people in your life. You don't know it perhaps. Some of you, you may. But I guarantee you, whether you know it or not, you have people in your life who are in the space with God where Judas was. And I hope that God can use you in their story to make them more like Peter, a story of restoration and redemption. So, here we go. All right, so that was just a quick aside. Thank you, Holy Spirit. So, they see Jesus, right? And when they saw him, I love this, they worshiped him, but some of them doubted. Which wouldn't you? Like, dude, we just saw you like publicly murdered like a month ago. Like, here you are. Oh, okay. I mean, those are really your only options. Worship, like, okay, wow. Or like, nah, bro. Right? Like, those are your choices. It's right there in the scripture. I'm just giving you some Bible study today, right? So, some of them doubted. So Jesus came to his disciples and told them, this is a crazy statement, I have been given all authority in heaven and on earth, right? I have been given all authority. All authority in heaven and on earth. That's pretty much all of it. And here's what's so incredible. Here's what's so incredible, is what Jesus says next. It's either the only invitation we have, or it's just garbage. There is no middle ground. Because this is all he has left, is this gathering on this hill. Very reminiscent to the previous passage we read in Matthew 16. He's gathering them on the hill and he says, okay, remember that gathering thing I told you about? Remember that church we're going to build together? Here's how you do it, right? I've been given all authority in heaven and on earth. So therefore, go and make disciples of all peoples, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I've given you, and be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. And if you're in this blue Bible, you're like, that's just the end of it? Well, what happened was, the moment Jesus got to the end of that sentence, it says in Acts that he just kind of floated up to heaven and disappeared. And so everybody's listening, really intent. Matthew's writing it down for us, thank goodness. And then all of a sudden he's like, where'd it go? Like, sounds great. Like, that's the intro. Like, that's the whole business plan. Like, we need strategic marketing. Do we start with a mailer? Like, what happens next? Like, who's in charge? Because Peter thinks it's him. Like, what do we do? And Jesus is just like, deuces, disciples, I'm out of here. Like, this is all we have. But if it's true, if what Jesus said, friends, is true, that all authority has been given to him on heaven and on earth, and this is what he's invited us to do, then it doesn't matter how we do it. Because he's with us. He seemed to trust us for some reason. And if you know anything about at least these first 11 disciples, like, 3 of them, the only ones you know about is because of how, like, messed up they were. The ones that you don't know their names, like, they were just, like, passive. So, like, Peter, at least he made stuff happen. I mean, made a ton of mistakes along the way. I love Peter, right? But he would just go for it and be like, whoops, get my foot out of my mouth. Like, that's fine. But Jesus is just like, hey, just go do it. And this is what I love, right? Jesus is the only leader that gave his life for his followers, and instead of asking his followers to give their lives back for him, said, no, you actually mimic what I did and you go give your lives for others. I mean, this is the gathering that Jesus invites us to. This is what the church is, right? Like, when you know where someone was buried and then you see them again, you are going to do what these first followers did. You're going to worship and or doubt, maybe both simultaneously, and that's okay. I mean, let's be real. Like this invitation, what we call the Great Commission, felt so out of place. But this is exactly what Jesus was about. Not to build a religious sect who would do things for him, but to gather disciples from all nations, all peoples, and invite them to do in their context exactly what Jesus did in his. And you have to remember, they were scared. They didn't even really like each other that much, right? And they obviously didn't have a super clear plan, but for some reason and somehow, as crazy as Jesus must have been to trust what he gave his life for to these people, the crazier thing is that it actually happened. And in Acts, which, gathers the story of what we call the first and early church, there was a place in Antioch, again, even further away than Caesarea Philippi, where the author of Acts, who we know as Luke, who was not a follower of Jesus, says the Christians, or the disciples, were called Christians first in Antioch. That there was this idea that these people, they weren't changing religions. Christian was a nickname, even a put down. Like, oh, you're trying to live your life like that guy who got killed? Like, that worked out well for him, right? But they weren't changing religions. They were changing allegiances. That they were following a Jewish carpenter who was crucified by Rome, that they now believe was God or became a god, but this strange God didn't require sacrifices. All the pagan gods in the Roman Empire, they required sacrifices. But this strange God claims to be the sacrifice. All the other gods that they could worship in Rome, they didn't really care how you live. They just cared that you gave them their resources, that you came to worship and sacrifice for them. But this Jesus came and started a movement that didn't circle around what we believed about God, but how we treated others. That it wasn't believe in the Lord your God, it was love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And so for 300 years, this group of people, they gathered under oppression. They cared for the sick. They elevated the status of women. They worshiped together, men, women, insiders, outsiders, enslaved and free. They lived generously, even to those that couldn't pay them back, and even to those that did them harm. They prayed boldly, not because of what they believed or who they voted for, but because of who they loved and who they followed. And the church was born. And the church survived. And again, the prophecy that we read in Matthew 16 came true. And just for a moment, if we could go back to that hillside when they're still staring up at the sky going, Jesus, come back, right? And we could tell them, hi, I'm from the future. Introductions. You're not going to believe this. But you see all those crosses around that represent death and fear and oppression by the Roman Empire? You're really not going to believe this. But one day, where I come from, one day in the future, people are going to wear that symbol as jewelry. And there's going to be crosses all over Rome and all around the Mediterranean rim and in far off places that you've never heard of, like America. And it's not going to represent the power and the brutality of the empire, because actually that empire is going to be gone. I know, it's hard to believe. But they're going to symbolize one cross, one specific one. And it's not going to be a symbol that makes you feel pain and death or political power. It's going to be a symbol of love and salvation and invitation. That people are going to cling to a cross when they're most hopeless for hope. I know it's so hard to believe, guys. It's so hard to believe that this could actually be possible. But one day in the not too distant future, because you're going to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, the one who sacrificed himself for the church. You are going to sacrifice yourself for the church. And so in my far distant land, thousands of years from now, the cross is going to be seen as a symbol of hope. I know it's impossible for you to even believe, and you can't comprehend this, but trust me. They couldn't possibly comprehend our reality. And so the question for us now, 2,000 years later, thousands of miles away from the events we just read about, is will we be like that first church, and ultimately like our Savior who sacrificed himself for our good? Will we be the kind of church, the kind of people, the kind of gathering, the kind of followers of Jesus who are willing to sacrifice ourselves for others? Now, luckily for us, we live in a place in the world where we're probably not going to have to actually give our lives. We're not going to actually have to die for our faith. There are spiritual siblings that we have in the world right now that actually do. But you may be called to give up your preferences. You may be called to adjust your schedule a little bit. You may be called to live generously and not buy something that you've been waiting for. That might be the sacrifice that we as the American church are invited to make. Because I think it's so important to understand that in these last 2 years and for a while, all you could do was watch online, but it did something in our soul where it magnified what was already happening in our life, where the church became something we watch or consume or assume that it will always be there for us and our children in the future whenever we are ready for it. And the reason I started with those stats is, friends, I have phone numbers and names of people that I know whose church is no longer there for their city. And they're fine. It was the right thing, and they decided. But I tell you that just to be we cannot assume that it's always going to be there. The church is always one generation away from change or destruction or disappearance. And we've seen it in our lifetime. I mean, I'm a millennial by 6 months, right? I was 1984, right? Just barely snuck in there. You're welcome, right? The world I grew up in and the church's role in that world does not exist anymore. And I can boo-hoo and be oh, it was so much easier back then, because it was, right? Or I can say, great, new world, new challenges, new opportunities, mission's still the same. Invitation's still the same. It might look different, it might have a different flavor, we might try new things and fail forward. Thank goodness for Peter, gave us a great example, right? But if Jesus is who he said he was and did what he said he was going to do, and will do in us what he promised to do, then I actually believe that there's hope for the church. I believe that the church can be restored. It must be restored. And the question is, are we the ones to do it? Are you the one to join in to do it? Will we assume it's always going to be there? Will we just watch or consume? Or will we engage, lean in, pray, and play our part to actually be the church for those who are, I promise you, watching and waiting? They may not say it. Their posture might feel antagonistic or aggressive. But I promise you, they are watching and waiting and wishing even, many of them, that the church would be restored to its original, countercultural, dignity-affirming, powerful through powerlessness, sinner-welcoming, hope-dispensing essence that Jesus modeled. I promise you. And so that only happens if we play our part. It takes all of us playing our part. It takes you playing your part, because the truth is, empowering all people to love and follow Jesus, that's not just the mission of our church. That's the invitation of the church. That's the invitation of Jesus. That's why it's our mission statement. case you're wondering how that works on the strategic back end, right? It's like, oh, what did Jesus say the church should do? Cool, let's do that, right? Jesus empowered us. He didn't do it himself. He left. And he said, I trust you. So we have to trust people. He says, I'm not asking you to build a religion. That's why we're out here in the wilderness on the hillside. No, I'm asking you to love and follow me. See a situation, go, what would Jesus do? I mean, remember the old school bracelets? Literally, like they had something clicking there, right? What would Jesus do at your job? What would Jesus do in your neighborhood? What would Jesus do in your marriage? What would Jesus do with your kid who's driving you nuts? What would Jesus do with your taxes? What would Jesus do? Whatever, fill in the blank. Like that is the invitation, to love and therefore follow Jesus. And it's for all people. If we miss that, we miss it. Because remember, we weren't on people's minds 1,000 years ago when Jesus launched this thing. America, where? Like, of all nations, what's a nation? Like, that's our transliteration. They're just like, okay, like, how about this person? Cool, hi. Like, that's how it starts. That's how it starts. Jesus and his followers didn't look like us, think like us, vote like us, and yet here we are. And so can we invite all people, regardless of who they look like, love, vote like, think like, look, come on. Like it's not that much of a stretch. It's become this big challenge, but empowering all people to love and follow Jesus, that's not just Restoration Church's thing. We're not trying to do something super like edgy and like new, right? It's just what the scriptures say. And last thing before we have some next steps here is when I talk to people, and I talk to people that are in our church, and I talk to a lot of people who have left the church too. Like it's a weird, side hustle I have, I guess. Doesn't pay well, and it's really good for my emotional stability. But when I talk to people that have left the church, not that have never been a part of it, but have been a part of it, who have invested a lot of their life and time and energy, and it disappointed them, and they left, or they were, shamed, and they decided to. I mean, like, and I just sit and I listen. It's never because they're like, what? I read the Bible and I read about Jesus, and he just seemed like a real jerk. I've never heard that, never once. I've definitely heard. I've read the Bible. And Jesus has just captivated my heart. And I think I even still believe in him. But man, his girlfriend makes it really difficult. Like the church is the bride of Christ. You got it. Okay, cool. I'm making sure. Yeah. He's Kevin McAllister in Home Alone going, Jesus, your girlfriend. Woof. Right? Like that's the moment. Okay, just making sure you're with me. And I just sit and listen and I go, I know. Me too. And I lead one. And we don't got it all perfect. We don't, believe me, you follow Katie and I, there's going to be bad things that happen occasionally. We're going to make mistakes. We're not going to get it all right all the time. What we can promise you is that we'll be honest and we'll go, whoops, that was an experiment, didn't work, right? We'll apologize. We'll treat each other with respect along the way, even if we disagree. Because that's the church. That was the 11 guys on the hillside. They didn't like each other. They didn't all agree. But here's the thing, and this is my invitation for us as we talk about next steps before we close, is if somewhere in your world, your perspective of the church has shaped itself to look like a buffet. I pay my entrance fee, and I take what I want, and I hope they have all the things today. Oh, you don't have my favorite dish. I'll go to a different one. If your perspective of the church has been like a buffet, I would like for you to change your perspective to be more like a family meal. To see the church, to treat the church, not like a buffet, but rather like a family dinner, where you have something to bring to the table. Maybe you gone to a family meal, and I know for me, when I go to family meals with my family, everybody brings something, and everybody has their greatest hits, right? It's everybody's highlight reel, and I don't like them all. I'll be honest with you. For me, Thanksgiving growing up, stuffing was inside the turkey, and it was gray and wet and had raisins in it. I was like, wah, right? And then I get married, and Katie's family is a lot of butter and white bread, and it's crispy and it's wonderful, and I'm like, I remember we're dating, we have our first Thanksgiving, I'm like, oh, I don't like stuffing. They're like, are you serious? Like, what's wrong with you? Like, if you want to keep this going, you got to try this. And I'm like, so glad I did, right? For, not just for the dressing, but for her too. Yeah, but you get the idea. But it's like do we treat the church like, oh, it's just here for me to get what I want? And when it doesn't, or when I don't like how they make that, I'm going to go find a different one. Or do we say, hey, I have something to bring because I'm empowered too. And trust me, and trust the hundreds of servant leaders in our church. When you change that perspective, you will get more out of it, I promise you. You will get way more out of it than attending a 1-hour event on a Sunday where you all face forward, listen to someone with a Britney Spears microphone on their face, talk for a little bit, right? You will get so much more out of it. Because friends, the church has an opportunity to shape the next generation's view of God. The church has an opportunity to care for those who are hurting and help people find belonging. The church has the opportunity to serve behind the scenes or up in front, whether it's cleaning or whether it's standing on a stage, to create environments where people find Jesus and take next steps like the 9 people who got baptized 2 weeks ago, right? The church has an opportunity to live generously so that we can give assistance to people in our city, in our church with food, school supplies, rent, therapy, or to respond to humanitarian crises around the world like in Haiti or Ukraine. That is what the church is for. And the church doesn't get it all right. And it has real flaws. But when the church is at its best, I don't know another organization who will help parents when they're brand new parents to learn how to care for and walk through their, welcome to the parenting world. It's wild and crazy and messy, right? To walk people through that and help people grieve their parents when they die. I don't know another organization on the planet that will help people when they're at their worst, get past addiction, recover in their marriage, find forgiveness from making a huge mistake in their life, and empower people to become their best. I don't know another organization that does both of those things. I don't know another organization that can be so connected to the needs of their specific local city and have a worldwide reach. I don't know of one. I mean, Amazon's great. They're everywhere, but that's not the same thing. I don't know another organization that takes a regular, seasonal experience and turns it into something that gives people life and hope and joy. I don't know another organization that's willing to be on the front lines of difficult conversations that's anchored to something transcendental that's been around for thousands of years to say this is where you can find hope and joy. This is where you can find life. And I don't know another organization whose primary design is to give of itself so that other people will benefit. I don't know of one. And again, Church in America does not get that all right all the time, but we have a chance to maybe do it differently. And so if you're here and you're like, yes, I am vibing with what you're saying, here is what I would invite you to do, is will you take a next step to move from watching to engaging? It really is that simple. We try to make it as easy as we possibly can, because with all her flaws, I believe you cannot authentically follow Jesus and remain disconnected from the church. The church isn't just a place to attend, more importantly, it's a people to become. It's a people to become, and you are invited. And so in the seat back pocket in front of you, there's a card that says, what's next? Don't worry, if it says I'm new, just flip it over, right? And I want to invite you to grab this card, really, like right now, grab this card. Do me a favor, even if you're not going to fill it out, humor me for just a moment. Grab the card. If you're in the front row, it's in the Bible under your seat. And I just want to encourage you, will you take a moment to just ask God, what's my next step? Maybe I've been coming for a while. Maybe I'm watching. If you're watching online, you can click the link below the viewing window to access this card online. But would you think about, hey, how can I take a next step? Maybe you have a question you want to ask. Maybe you want to get connected in a group of people beyond a Sunday, to go from a row to a circle, from a crowd to a community. Maybe you want to get baptized. You saw those people take that step a couple weeks ago. You're like, you know what? I was nervous in the moment, but I want to take that step. Maybe you want to get involved by serving around here and playing a part in what we're doing. Maybe you want to start giving and saying, I don't have a lot, but I want to invest my resources into something like that. Or maybe, just maybe, you're here this morning, and as I'm talking about this idea of Jesus, you're like, you know what? The thing that has kept me at a distance, it hasn't been Jesus. It's been the church. And I get it. Doing one message on it isn't going to fix everything. But maybe for you this morning, you're like, you know what? I've resisted Jesus from the church, and can I just plead with you, don't do that? Please, don't do that. Jesus is inviting you to follow him. Go to Jesus. And maybe that's your next step this morning. So let me pray for us. Then I have a couple more songs we're going to sing and wrap up. But thanks for hanging with me today. I know it was a lot, but this is just something we're so passionate about. That's why we call ourselves Restoration Church. We want to be a place that can restore not just the idea of church, but can restore people. That we would be a gathering of the called out ones and the sent ones that would make a difference in our world and in our city. So let's pray together. God, thank you. Thank you for the reality that you are the one that started the church. You gave your life for it. And you invite us to do the same, not for you to pay you back, but for others. That is what it looks like to love and follow you. And so for those of us this morning that might be their next step is to start following you, God, I pray you give them courage. That they would say yes to you, knowing that you've already said yes to them. God, for those of us that feel it, like, well, I got a lot to figure out, and I'm busy, but your Spirit is empowering and encouraging them to take a step to move from watching or attending to actually engaging into building and restoring your church. I pray that they would do that, knowing that what is in front of them is so exciting. And that we would be the kind of place that what would be true of us collectively would make people want to look to you. That as Peter would write to the churches of his day, that it would be true of us that people would see our good deeds and they would praise our Father in heaven. That there would be something about our lives and our activity collectively together that would make people go, tell me more about this person you claim to follow. That people would have a spiritual experience that represents what we celebrate today on Juneteenth, that there has been freedom that has been made available to you. And no one told you yet. And that's why we're here. What an incredible opportunity you have entrusted to us, Jesus. You have literally risked your reputation on us. And while we can't control everything, we can decide today, individually and collectively as Restoration Church, that we want to represent you well. We want to show people what it's like to love and follow you. So we pray this in your name. Amen.